Hi everyone, it's Darren. Welcome. Today we're going to talk about another election topic. We're going to talk about third-party spoilers. Uh, they require a little bit of explanation, but before we do that, I'm going to remind you that all of my election videos I try to keep as free of politics as possible. The goal is simply to explain using data what's going on, what's possible, what's not possible. So. I know I have political views, you have political views. They may or may not match, but within the videos and within the comments down below, we need to keep this politics free. So we're going to focus just on the data. So, first, what is a third party spoiler? So, in the US, we have, for good or bad, what is generally considered to be a two-party system. Now, we do have more than two parties, obviously, uh, but popular belief is that only a candidate from one of those two parties can win the presidency. We'll discuss later whether or not that's actually the case statistically or not, but that is the belief. A third party spoiler, then, is a candidate from a different party that comes in and siphons votes predominantly away from one candidate instead of the other. And in the event that, let's say, the results were going to be 55% to 45%, and a third party candidate comes in and they manage to take enough votes from that top candidate that now the second place candidate wins. That's the spoiler. And it's happened in the past, and it's not always the case with third party votes, third party candidates. So, why that's a problem is it can lead to your least desirable candidate being elected. Uh, One of the things that people think about the two-party system is that you don't necessarily pick the candidate that you like, you pick the lesser of two evils. And the problem with a third-party spoiler candidate is if you vote for the third-party candidate, that might mean that you're actually casting your effective vote for the greater of two evils because you took the vote away from the other one that you would have preferred, who might have actually won. And again, is it possible the third party candidate can win? We will get to that. So who are the actual spoilers and how do we determine it? Okay, so if we go back to the beginning of the U.S. presidential elections, we go back to 1789. George Washington was elected. Uh, no party. Uh, he had a bunch of people running. A bunch of people got electoral votes. They didn't have political parties at all. The Constitution doesn't say anything about political parties, doesn't guarantee political parties, doesn't give political parties any special rights or anything. They just kind of happened. Um, so we go a little bit further, and you start to see parties forming, and you still, though, you have a lot of groups, and you have votes spread across them. And the presidential elections were a little different back then as well. The presidential election used to be, as originally defined in the Constitution, uh, each elector would cast two votes. Now, elector in this case is a member of the Electoral College, not a person, as a citizen casting a vote. Uh, I'll do a video on how the Electoral College works. It's weird to say the least, uh, but that's the system we have today, so that's what we're stuck with. So each elector cast two votes, and the person with the most votes became president. The person with the second most votes became vice president. And that led to situations where the president and vice president could be different parties. They could be the same party, but they could be different parties as well. And that worked sort of okay up until you hit 1800 here, with Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr each getting 73 electoral votes. We know Thomas Jefferson became president. Aaron Burr did not. So at this point, we started getting a lot less candidates as well. Uh, so you really started seeing a lot more two party voting. Um, 1924, the the source I found said there weren't really distinct parties for any of those people at that point. Let's go up to certain sort of more modern times where things were a little bit closer to normal. And if we look at some of these, the ones I've highlighted in yellow were the ones where a third party candidate actually had enough votes to potentially have shifted the results. We don't really have tons of information without going into in-depth history for some of these older ones. So let's run up to some newer ones here. Let's go up to 1968. In 1968, Richard Nixon was running for president. It's his first time running for president. Uh, Herbert Humphrey was running as his Democratic opponent, and George Wallace was running on the American Party, a third party. It was the first time the American Party had really been prominent on the ballot. Uh, George Wallace, we're modern enough times, we have lots of information about him. Uh, his policies, his governing approach, very closely aligned to the Democratic policies, very closely aligned to Democratic governing approach. Because of this, it strongly believed that he pulled most of his votes from the Democratic candidate and very few votes from the Republican candidate. And that's the formula for making a political spoiler. And in this case, the difference between the Democratic and Republican candidate and the popular vote was not that much. It was less than 1 million votes. The electoral votes are far different than that, but you break that down by state as well, and we'll do that on election here in a minute. But he had 10 times that many. So, given that it's believed by historians that virtually all of his votes came from Humphrey, uh, George Wallace was a spoiler. If Wallace had not run, if people had not voted for him, we would have had Humphrey instead of Nixon elected in 1968. And we know how Nixon's political career ran. Of course, that was going into the 1972 election and just after the 72 election. So Wallace pretty much viewed generally as a spoiler. He changed the election results as a third party candidate. Here's another third party candidate, didn't really have any impact, had almost 6 million votes, but didn't really have an impact on the election. Then we come up here to Ross Perot. Ross Perot, I wasn't around for the other one. I do remember Ross Perot. Uh, Perot was an interesting person. Uh, one of the billionaire candidates. Uh, I think he might have been the first billionaire candidate. Uh, he had a mix of Democratic and Republican policy views. He had a mix of Democratic and Republican governing views. Um, so there's some disagreement on whether or not he actually was a spoiler or not. One thing that is known with Ross Perot, though, is it's pretty widely accepted that he was pretty strongly anti George Bush. So while his political beliefs may have been kind of in the middle, um, and he may have otherwise drawn sort of equally from both, uh, because of his very strong anti George Bush views, and that sort of took votes away from Bush because he would just attack him. So in 1992, uh, historians are mixed, but they do lean towards him having been a spoiler. Uh, they also lean towards him having a pretty significant ego. which is why he ran again in 1996. In 1996, he got less than half the votes he did in 92. And again, because of the mix between the Democratic and the Republican sides, it, there, Bush was not on the ballot. Uh, Historians think he probably wasn't a spoiler in 96. So probably was in 92, probably wasn't in 96. Um, he's in a case where he was in the middle. And yeah, being in the middle is not a bad thing, but not being a main party candidate, he probably didn't have a chance. He didn't really have anything that stood out. So let's go on to the next one, 2000. Uh, we all know about Bush and Gore. If you were alive and watching the news in 2000, the Bush Gore election was ugly. It was just bad. Um, it's an election that will forever be noted in history books with an asterisk that will take you to a footnote that says the election was determined by the US Supreme Court, not by the vote of the people, because they stopped counting the votes in the Supreme Court ordered Florida to stop counting votes. So those votes will probably never get accurately tabulated to determine who the actual winner was. Bush was appointed president and then was reelected 4 years later. So based on his reelection, you could say that he apparently did a good enough job at least. But Ralph Nader, um, who didn't have a great turnout, only did about 3 million votes, or less than 3 million votes. Very strongly Democratic aligned. Uh, Policies much closer to Democratic than Republican, governing much closer to Democratic than Republican. So historians will tell you, political scientists will tell you, he took a lot more Democratic votes than he took Republican votes. And what I mean by that is if Nader had not run, those most of those 2,882,955 voters would have still cast their vote for someone else. And the political science people and the historians tell us most of those would have gone to Al Gore, and Al Gore would have won the election. As we go into the 2024 election, there are a couple of groups talking about launching a third party bid, and there are already complaints that those will act as spoilers. Uh, Too early to say yet, uh, but it's possible. We're looking at the national level. The state levels are different. Okay, let's jump on to the 2000 state by state vote. Uh, Brief summary the way the Electoral College works in most states. You have each state gets one vote for each senator and one vote for each member of the House of Representatives. Each state always has two senators. Uh, each state's number of representatives is proportional to the state population at the census. So Alabama has three, so they have two senators and seven. Excuse me, Alabama has nine, so they have two senators and seven representatives. Alaska has three, very low population. They only have one representative, but they still have two senators. Bush's vote, and we have Gore's vote, and we have Nader's vote. Now, if we come down here in the Nader column, you're not seeing a whole lot of electoral votes here. That's because he didn't get any. Uh, but he did get a decent percentage of people in some states. Here in Alaska, he pulled 10% of the popular vote. That the most he picked up? Yeah, that was like the most he got. A lot of states were considerably less. Here in South Dakota, he got nothing. Um, so how did he affect the vote? Well, let's do some math, and that's what this channel's about: is using data to understand things. So let's look at, did Bush win? So to tell if Bush won, I'm just going to look at column. Just going to look at column E, and E will tell me if Bush won the vote. So if E is not blank, Bush won. So E equals, if E3 is greater than 0, then true, else false. Okay, Bush won Alabama. Okay, so let's see what we have here. We have Bush won Alabama, Alaska, and Arizona, lost California and Connecticut and DC and Delaware. Uh, so you get a mix of wins and loses here. And I have a popular margin, and I also have Nader's popular vote for that state. So for Nader to have been able to make a difference, what we need to do is Nader's popular vote has to have been bigger than the popular margin. This is just the Bush minus Gore difference. So if in Alabama here, for example, Nader had 18,000 votes, but there's a 248,000 vote difference. That's not going to make any difference. So if I look at the possible difference here, so that means if um, Bush win equals true, so that's equals, and N3 equals true, and L3 is less than I3, then maybe. Sorry, I changed it for me there, but that's all right. If maybe, else nothing. So did Bush make a difference in Alabama? No. Let's copy this down and see where he may have made a difference. Okay, so a lot of these states, Bush didn't make a difference, but you get down here to Florida, and Florida, Bush won by 537 votes. Nader had 97,488 votes. And people say, historians say, political scientists say, most of that came, a pretty substantial portion, well over half, came from Democrats, came from Gore, which means that that would have flipped the 25 electoral votes for Florida. When's the next state? Maybe. New Hampshire. Bush won New Hampshire by 7,211 votes. Uh, Nader had triple that. So, is it possible here? This is probably the place where he changed the election. So, because Nader ran, we had Bush instead of Gore. Whether that was a good or bad thing, again, I'm not going to speculate on that here. Uh, it did pretty solidly look like it changed the election, however. So looking at the 2020 election, we can say that a third party candidate can, in fact, be a spoiler. Spoilers are real. Has a third party candidate ever won? Well, not really. Let's come back here and take a look here. So if we look at elections back in time with people with significant votes that were even remotely close, we're back to George Wallace, who was close and lost and probably was a spoiler. So he probably changed the election. Go back further, the Democratic Party split definitely changed, had the potential to change the election. Democrats still won with Truman, even with the Democratic Party split there. Um, Third party candidate here, although uh, Teddy Roosevelt was hardly a political outsider. He had been a Republican president in the past. Uh, and we keep going back. Here, Democrats split, and that gave the Republicans the win. Democrats split, gave the Republicans the win. We have some parties that are dropping out here. The Whig Party, but again, these are only two parties running. So before we go on to the conclusions, if you've enjoyed this video, if you got anything out of it, please do hit like and subscribe. Two reasons for that. One, those likes and subscribes really keep YouTube creators like me motivated to keep making content. The second reason is it tells the YouTube algorithms, hey, these videos are worth watching, and then it's going to show this to more people. So it's going to help to spread the channel, and that's going to help to keep me motivated to keep making these videos as well. If you can, I also have a Patreon page at patreon.com/data analysis excellence. If you can help out there, that'd be great. A few bucks a month. If you don't want to do that, that's fine too. Just please do like and subscribe. Okay, on to the conclusions. Um, can a third party candidate be a spoiler? Absolutely. We've seen it. Um, we know Ralph Nader was a spoiler in 2020. We know Ross Perot was probably a spoiler in 1992. We know George Wallace was a spoiler in 1968. So, yes, a third party candidate can definitely be a spoiler. Can a third party candidate win? It's never happened. Uh, Statistically, it's possible, but it's never happened. Uh, so, I guess I would put that into the technically possible category, but improbable. Is voting for a third party candidate throwing away your vote? That one too depends. Uh, if we look at an election like, let's look at Eisenhower and Stevenson in 1956. Um, if there had been a third party candidate in there who had polled a couple thousand votes, not going to have made a difference. Um, your vote, whichever one you voted for, probably wouldn't have made much difference. They're just so far apart. Uh, Almost no state went with Stevenson. So there it probably wouldn't have mattered. If you had voted for Nader in 2020, especially if you were in one of those two states where he could have made a difference, especially Florida, but also New Hampshire. If you had voted for Nader in Florida, and that's a very tiny percentage of people that swayed that election, um, Yeah, you would have not only thrown away your vote, you would have potentially thrown the vote to the person you didn't want to win. So in that case, you would have been harming yourself by voting for a third party candidate. Um, is there hope for third party candidates in the future? That's beyond the scope of this video. It's beyond the scope of my channel. Uh, as you remember from the beginning, I said we are only looking at the statistics. We're looking at the numbers. We're looking at the data. Um, Other countries manage third parties and do it just fine, and they form coalition governments and things. Um, the U.S. early on had lots of parties or no parties, and then went back to lots of parties. Um, but certainly didn't start with a two-party system. There's no guarantee of a two-party system in the Constitution or any laws. Um, the Electoral College complicates things, and we'll talk about that more in the Electoral College video. So like and subscribe and hit notify so you can see when that one comes out. So that's all the conclusions I have for you. I don't have an absolute answer, but I said I can say third-party candidates can be spoilers. They have been spoilers in the past, but it hasn't always been the case. And I can say that, you know, technically it's possible a third-party candidate could theoretically win, but that's never happened. So those are our conclusions. Hope you learned something from the video, and hope to see you again soon.